1941, on Betty's 20th birthday, in a lecture on women in Nazi Germany, she recorded what Douglas had to say about the condition of women under German National Socialism. Professor Douglas mentioned what she called the feminist movement. In contrast, she talked about the traditionalism of the National Socialist attitude to women, children, and family. Nazis insisted, she noted Douglas as saying, on placing children at the center of family lives. Wow, that's concentration camp, wasn't it? During the summer of her junior year, 1941, guided by Professor Douglas, Betty even attended a summer course at the famous, or rather notorious, activist training camp, Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. Her biographer, Judith Hennessy, in this book comments, "The most profound thing that happened to Betty at Smith was her radicalization. She became committed to Marxist philosophy." Betty, yes, thrived at Smith, soaking up the ideas of leftist teachers and becoming the radical. Again, from this book, she was the campus radical, an old friend said, passionate, with wild hair, a firebrand. Beginning in 1940, while still a junior at Smith, she became an outspoken advocate of the Popular Front, a pro-communist umbrella that embraced a broad range of all kinds of leftist radical groups. She put her beliefs into practice. Betty was firebrand editor of the campus newspaper. According to biographer Daniel Horowitz, under Betty Goldstein, the Smith campus paper became notorious for its radicalism. Bob Easton, her first boyfriend there, whom she visited at Harvard, remembered, and I quote again from biography written by Hennessy. He said, "I had lefty feelings, but not as much as she. She contributed to the Daily Worker." And the Daily Worker was the official newspaper of Communist Party USA. In 1942, Betty Goldstein graduated from Smith College, where she received a degree in psychology. Then she spent 1 year doing graduate work in psychology at Berkeley. While at Berkeley, her social milieu consisted of active members of the Communist Party, and her writings reflected a line directed from Moscow. She was a member of the Young Communist League, says Professor Horowitz, on page 93 of this book. Horowitz also documents Betty's numerous personal close relationships with Communist Party operatives, including her romantic involvement with physicist David Bohm. A Communist Party member, Bohm worked on the Manhattan Project, developing the atomic bomb. He would later invoke the Fifth Amendment while testifying in front of the U.S. Congress and leave the United States shortly thereafter. After leaving Berkeley, her first job in New York City was as a journalist at what was called Federated Press, America's premier leftist news service established by Communist Party members. It was the most sustained effort in American history, in Horowitz's words, to develop a left-wing news service. She worked there from 1943 to 1946. In 1944, Betty Goldstein made efforts to actually join the Communist Party and work for People's World, one of the party's newspapers, but was turned down because, according to her FBI file, I quote, "There already were too many intellectuals in the labor movement," says Professor Horowitz on page 93 of this book. And in 1944, an informant told the FBI that Frieden went to a party office in the East Bay Area, announced that she was already a member of the Young Communist League, and sought entrance to the party itself, as well as a job writing for its paper, the People's World, says Daniel Flynn in his article, Modern Feminism's matriarch unmasked. But yes, Friedan was indeed refused entry and was reportedly told that she could serve the Soviet cause better from outside of the official Communist Party. She would be more useful as a psychologist, and this is from her official biography, page 36. After being fired from Federated Press to make room for man, or because of her excessively pro-Soviet positions, the evidence is not entirely clear. Her next job from 1946 to 1952 was as a staff reporter, some would say propagandist is the more accurate term, for UE News, the newspaper of the radical United Electrical, Radio and Machine Workers of America. According to historian Ronald Schatz, this labor union was, and I quote, the largest communist-led institution of any kind in the United States. This union was among the most radical, most militant unions in the United States. In his authoritative book on the CIO, another historian, Robert Ziegler, states that UE was, I quote, the only effectively led large pro-Soviet affiliate of the CIO in the post-war years. Betty Goldstein wrote articles also for the Daily Worker and New Masses that were both official Communist Party publications. In 1947, US Congress targeted the UE as a communist front, and its membership began a steady decline. Well, both outfits she worked for in her young years, the Federated Press and the UE News, were ostensibly union publications, but in reality were nothing but communist fronts. Well, again, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. Then she got married to Carl Friedan. His last name actually was Friedman, but for some reason they just dropped letter M. And if the home was a comfortable concentration camp, as Mrs. Friedan claimed, in the feminine mystique, this is not something she really knew from her own experience. No, not at all. Living in a lavish mansion, she was freed from housework by the services of a full-time maid. Her husband earned a large salary and supported Betty and the children. The parents of her children's playmates even ejected Friedan from their carpooling arrangement when they learned that she sent their children to school in a taxi rather than driving them herself. The locked-up, middle-class homemaker that Friedan styled herself to be was an embroidered tale, says Daniel Flynn in his article, Modern Feminism's Matriarch Unmasked. Her famous description of the American family household as a comfortable concentration camp in the feminine mystique, therefore, had much more to do with her Marxist leanings than with any of her actual experience as a housewife or mother, says David Horowitz, no relation to Daniel Horowitz, in his article, Betty Friedan's Secret Communist Past, published in online Salon magazine on January 18, 1999. In her autobiography, Life So Far, Friedan portrays herself as a devoted housewife. But according to her ex-husband, Carl Friedan, Betty was no stay-at-home mom, not at all. Her ex-husband, also a leftist, by the way, complained that his wife, and I quote, was in the world during the whole marriage, had a full-time maid, and seldom was a wife and a mother. And he says, again, we had a full-time maid during our entire 19-year marriage. That's who took care of the 3 kids, cooked everything. He said, I would say as a housewife, on a scale of 0 to 10, she was a 2. End of quote. Carl Friedan's memories were not motivated by politics. He was, in fact, very proud of his ex-wife's accomplishments. And he says, I quote, "I am proud of what she did for the world. Betty being monstrous in pursuit of her goals doesn't bother me at all. She changed the course of history almost single-handedly. And it took a monster, perhaps a driven, super-aggressive, egocentric, almost lunatic dynamo to rock the world the way she did. Unfortunately, she was the same person at home, where this kind of conduct does not work." End of quote. It is important to know that Daniel Horowitz did not intend to write his book as an expose. No, throughout the book, Horowitz is clearly sympathetic to Friedan's feminist objectives. Although Horowitz is a sympathetic leftist himself, still, Betty Friedan refused to cooperate with him once she realized he was going to tell the truth about her life as Betty Goldstein. After he published an initial article about Friedan's youthful work as a labor journalist, Friedan maligned him, saying to an American university audience, I quote her, she said, "Some historian recently wrote some attack on me in which he claimed that I was only pretending to be a suburban housewife, that I was supposed to be an agent." End of quote. This was particularly unkind because, as I said, Friedan's professor biographer is such a fellow traveler himself that he bends in this book over backwards throughout this book to sanitize the true dimensions of Friedan's past and defends actually Friedan's lying as a response to, well, surprise, surprise, McCarthyism. Horowitz claims that the fear of McCarthyism, a word that curiously graces this book's pages on more than 100 occasions, prevented Friedan from telling the truth about her activities during the 1940s and 1950s. As a Jew, a radical, and a woman, Friedan was particularly vulnerable to right-wing persecution, Horowitz says, and he chronicles the so-called Red Scare nightmares and concludes that Friedan realized that neither her writings nor feminist thought would gain currency if tainted with old left radicalism. The myth of the trapped housewife was a necessary fiction. Still, as I said, Betty Friedan refused to cooperate with Professor Horowitz and accused him of red biting. Why? Because her book, The Feminine Mystique, would not have sold over 5 million copies if her subversive background were known. Communists operate by subterfuge, pretending to be just like us. Well, בטח בולות תעשה לך מלחמה. Once Friedan became famous, Horowitz complained, journalists, authors of standard reference works, and historians simply repeated the narrative of her life offered in The Feminine Mystique and elsewhere, like in her autobiography and official biography. Because those writings about Friedan so often sympathized with her views, they didn't bother to investigate her past and instead relied on her word. Horowitz himself questioned whether it was appropriate to make public the inconvenient information he discovered about Friedan. Horowitz claims that we live in, and I quote, he says,